Hi, my name is Michael Kennedy, and the school where I teach at is fairly diverse in terms of the students' ethnic backgrounds. So, the law that I wanted to focus on today was Brown versus the Board of Education. Brown versus the Board of Education was a milestone decision in May of 1954, which ruled that segregation in all U.S. schools was no longer allowed based on race. So the Supreme Court ruled that separating children on the basis of race was unconstitutional. Brown versus the Board of Ed ended legalized racial segregation in schools, which override the 1986 Plessy versus Ferguson case that set forth the separate but equal principle. Segregation of public schools was a violation of the 14th Amendment and was then considered unconstitutional. It wasn't until September 25th, 1957, which was 60 years ago today, that 9 black students enrolled at an otherwise all-white high school in Little Rock, Arkansas. There was major opposition, even from the state's governor, and a mob of protesters who prevented the students from going to school for 3 weeks. Even though many people in the civil rights movement were thrilled by the new court decision, it was met with much resistance. Some thought the Supreme Court overstepped its bounds by implementing new law. Advocates of civil rights thought the Supreme Court appropriately used its power to face new issues in new times. The ruling gave momentum for legal equality that led to the passage of the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Acts a decade later. Some disparities remain between whites and African Americans in terms of education today. White students complete college at higher rates than African Americans. The central mission for Brown to encourage integration is unfinished at best. In addition to African Americans, Hispanics also suffer inequality compared to white students. A study shows that 3/4 of African Americans and 2/3 of Hispanic students attend schools where a majority of the students qualify as low income. So going back to Brown, even though there were initial gains for African Americans, African American children are still racially and socioeconomically isolated. Some argue that until housing inequality is remedied, education inequality will not be remedied. After Brown, there was a moral focus on education equality and continued with the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, also known as the ESA, that was passed as a player in the war on poverty. Since ESA, the focus shifted to achievement of academic excellence, which is not culturally responsive to the populations that make up urban schools. Unfortunately, many children do not have access to educational excellence because of race and poverty. According to the Government Accountability Office, schools with high percentages of poor and African American or Hispanic students offer much less math and science classes and had higher rates of students held back, suspended, or expelled. So that about wraps up my review for Brown versus the Board of Education. And while it was a milestone case, I think there's still a ways to go.